Hello and welcome to this computing web seminar on 6 steps to successful business process management. My name is Stuart Sumner, Chief Reporter at Computing, and I'll be your host. Organisations are turning to business process management to drive cost savings and efficiency and to raise customer service and profitability. However, the inherently interconnected nature of business processes make them often difficult to define and automate in isolation. Business process change projects are notorious for mission creep, as more functions are sucked into the process. Large-scale projects can feel like dismantling the company and rebuilding it, with all the accompanying disruption and change management issues. Where business processes cross functional silos, innate resistance to change can jeopardize success. These are just some of the issues we'll be discussing today. So to help us with this discussion, I'm delighted to be joined by 3 panelists. Firstly, I'm pleased to welcome consultant editor Andrew Charlesworth. Next to Andrew, we have Barry O'Reilly, Director of BPM Solutions at Oracle EMEA. And next to Barry, we have Adrian Wright, CEO at Estafet. Now, before I hand over to Andrew for our first presentation, there are just a few points of housekeeping. On the screen in front of you, you will see a Slides tab, which will show Andrew's and Barry's slides today. A Questions tab. You click on this tab to submit questions to us in the studio. You can submit your questions now and throughout the web seminar today. You will also see a tab marked Poll Questions. I'll be inviting you to take part in 2 polls later on today. And under the Biographies tab, you can find more information on our speakers. That, you'll be delighted to hear, is the end of the housekeeping. So this computing web seminar will look at some of the issues that beset business process management projects, drawing on research among computing's readership and the customer experience of our systems integrator. You'll have the opportunity to put your questions to the panel, as well as getting first-hand insight into end-user experiences. Before I introduce the first speaker today, though, I'm going to open up our first poll question today, giving you the opportunity to tell us what's of most concern to you. So that should now be live. We're asking, what is or was the scope of your BPM project? And there are a few multiple choice answers for you here. The first one is just a single process. Secondly, a few processes within a defined area. Thirdly, processes which span the organisation and trading partners. And lastly, a large number of processes fundamental to the operation of the organisation. You can enter your answers to the first poll at any time during our first speaker presentation. Once our speaker is finished, I'll close the poll and feed back the results. Now, let's look at the planning and implementation phase of a BPM project. Andrew is going to present the results of some recent research by Computing. So Andrew, over to you.
Okay, so thanks, Stuart. What I'd like to do first is draw attention to some of the research that we did with the computing audience recently. Now, it's obviously difficult to talk about BPM as an ongoing sort of generic thing, so we've honed in really on IT's role in implementing BPM projects. Typically, that would be automation of existing manual tasks, business process change, process consolidation projects and the like. Now, business processes are notoriously hard to define. Easy example in, say, a manufacturing company, what defines the process of delivering a product to a customer's order? Clearly it involves actually making the thing, but does it just end at the termination of the production line? In a just-in-time setup, does it include ordering the components and materials to make the product from the upstream suppliers? Does it include marketing to stimulate the order in the first place? Probably not. But does it end at fulfillment or other elements of post-sales support? So we know that the processes are very much interrelated across different functions of the organisation, and so knock-on effects from any BPM project to the rest of the unchanged processes can bedevil any project which is less than well scoped. Now we can see this phenomenon reflected in this first chart from the research. These are the things which respondents said were their biggest challenges when undergoing BPM projects. Now, usually when we do these surveys, budget and skills are the number 1 and 2 hurdles to overcome. And that's true pretty much for everything that IT touches. Now, yes, budget is the number one concern here, but it's closely followed in the headache stakes by things like project creep, complexity and knock-ons, and coordinating processes that cross functional silos. Now, we're going to dig into that cross-silo processes issue later on, but I think the first thing we should probably look at is this idea of defining processes and project creep. So let's sort of talk about that issue, shall we?
Fantastic. Thanks, Andrew. So if Andrew's presentation has raised any issues you'd like to discuss, please ask a follow-up question for the panel. So Andrew's mentioned budget and skills there as two of the top concerns, but he also mentioned project creep, complexity and knock-on problems as processes rarely sit in isolation. But these all sound like issues that can be resolved by planning properly up front. So would you agree with that, Barry?
Yes, I think so. I think you've got to decide really with BPM what direction you're going, right? And that means obviously sitting down and working out what processes you have, which are the most important ones to you, and so forth and etc. But I think at the same time you need to actually be very clear on the actual specifics of those processes. Now there's something called analysis paralysis that can go on, which is where people sit down and simply do a lot of navel gazing all day and work out their processes. That's fine, but it goes in, it may not provide you particular returns. So I think it's very important to sit down, choose specific processes that have specific boundaries and that can be implemented in a specific amount of time. And if you can do that, then you can deliver returns, you can automate your processes and do it in a specific amount of time, in a specific amount of budget, and then get the results. That's why I think when we look at the survey, we see that probably the least difficult thing is actually getting in senior management sponsorship for it. So I think that's easy. I think it's after that, making sure that you're very strict about scope is the critical thing after that.
Fantastic, thanks Barry. Adrian, would you like to come in on that point?
Yes, I mean I'll pick up on Barry's point about the senior management sponsorship being limited. It's being easy. That's quite interesting because a lot of projects that we see, we don't actually have that senior management sponsorship, which changed the whole characteristic of a BPM project from a BPM process and roadmap into is it actually useful in this particular project to get this delivered. And I think that's quite important because if we are looking at BPM as it should be, then we should have sponsorship from CEO or CIO level that allows that strategic vision to be created whilst projects are being delivered at the same time. And I think that's really critical. And that then ties back into budget availability. If you don't have CEO and CIO sort of with you or bought into the idea of BPM, then I would imagine budget becomes a huge issue because they are just focused on individual projects. So we're looking at the ROI of a project, not is this business going to drive its IT through a BPM method and approach. I think that's important.
Fantastic, thanks Adrian. So one of the things I'd like to ask now, one of the things that I think is interesting that's come out so far is that how do you know where to start and stop a BPM project? If in a sense, if you're taking a very broad scope and if it's like rebuilding the company, how do you know what to include, what not to include? How do you know when to cut off the line and say, no, we've got a clearly defined project here, we can't expand any further? Barry, could you come in on that one?
Yeah, I think there's an important balance to be made here between the technical and the strategic. Right? So I think, and you can call that top down and bottom up if you want to call it that way. But I think it's very important to approach it in both directions. One is in terms of the tactical projects, making sure you choose specific projects, specific processes that deliver specific value, but don't try to boil the ocean in terms of reassembling the entire company. That'll come later. I think once you've built up a certain groundswell of processes, which then provide a specific level of value, that'll get visibility at a management level, and then the whole strategic thing will start kicking in. I see very few process initiatives that come top down, that they come entirely from a let's re-engineer the entire company. Those kind of approaches have been tried before. They have relative degrees of success, but from a technology point of view, now we can support actually automating the processes, actually measuring those processes, and actually delivering then the KPIs and the actual metrics on those processes higher up. That then will lead into a strategic overall framework in terms of what we're trying to do with the company, how we're trying to evolve the process, make it process oriented, deliver value to the executive board, and get the dashboards and the metrics and so forth. Then that'll drive the strategic direction.
Fantastic.
One of our chief architects always has a good expression, which is think globally and act locally, which he borrowed from the Green Movement. But that really sums it up for me in terms of what we should be doing when we're looking at a BPM project. We've got to know where we're going, we've got to think about the big picture, but we've got to pick something that we can work with, that we can actually implement, and that's the local part of that expression, and I quite like that as a sort of way of summing it up.
Fantastic, thank you. Andrew, do you have any comment to make on this area?
No, what I found interesting was when doing the research, I mean, I'm sort of old enough to remember the sort of phases of business process re-engineering that went on in the sort of mid-90s. And one of the big problems was, how do you define the processes? And when I came back to this subject, I didn't expect that to be a problem. But people still struggle with it. And I think that, that's quite a valid thing, because quite often these things are hidden under the surface. Processes that you just don't expect to be part of a particular function end up suddenly popping up in the whole automation project. So, yeah, I think people really struggle with just defining processes in the first place.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And we have we come across specific issues of that again and again when we're trying to define a process. A good example of that is whereby we work with the business, we define a process, and then we find many, many sub-processes underneath that. The business almost assume that is something that is done naturally, of course. To give you an example, if you have a claims process and you have a policy number given to you at a call centre, you retrieve that policy information, maybe that has name and address on it. That name and address, you're there in front of the customer's on the end of the phone, and the customer says, oh, I'd like to update that address I've just moved. So what you have now is you have a process that we identified, which was retrieve information. Now we're getting a sub-process, which is update that information. Now we could call that scope creep. We could call that not identifying the process correctly in enough detail, but we need techniques to work with the business to make sure they understand both the IT implications, but also the sub-levels of process as we go through that.
Fantastic. Okay, I think we could probably talk quite a lot longer on this sort of issue, but I think we need to move the conversation on a little bit. Barry, a question for you. Why do people find the most challenging thing to be coordinating processes? And I think you have a slide to talk us through on this subject.
Yeah, I think the issue around this is really what we've been talking about in terms of where do we actually start. So I think the important thing is actually not to sit down and say, well, this process leads to that process and so forth. That's all very true, but I think there's a bit of best practice out there in terms of how we approach this, and that's defined on this slide. So if you look at this slide, along the bottom I put process complexity. Now, there are a number of metrics for this. It could be the number of process steps, it could be the number of integration points, it could be the number of process participants, it could be the number of transactions, whether it goes cross-silo, particularly exceptions in processes are very important metrics as well, right? So, and then you can put up the scale, the process impact. So this would be some kind of return for this process. So, revenue, cost, customer service, cycle time, those kinds of things. And part of this is gut feeling, of course, part of it's hard facts. I think that if we're talking about the call center example, as Adrian just was, in fact, most call center managers that I speak to actually know where a lot of the time is spent in terms of calls. That data is somehow in there. They know they spend 30% of the time on changes, they know they spend 20% of the time on customer service, this whatever it is, right? So they know where they're spending their time and where they're spending effort. They also know where, by automating a particular part of that call center process, they'd have the highest impact. So then I think it's relatively, I mean, yes, there's a bit of debate about this, but in a day or 2 day workshop, we can thrash this out and we can actually identify, hone in on those processes which are up on the upper left-hand quadrant of this slide, right? Now, in financial services, that might be risk management, which has very high impact, and yet is actually not as complex as you might think. Claims eligibility, for instance, not actually the claims process, but claims eligibility is an important one in health insurance, for instance, and so forth and etc. Right? So we can choose processes which have a high impact, but yet are relatively simple to start with, and that's where you should cut your teeth. That's where you should do your first process, right? And after that, move forward, right? So don't do the other way around. Don't start with kind of trying to complete the entire process life cycle, the entire process, for the company, but start with something that is relatively clear and yet gives you very high impact. That's, I think, the approach, and then we can build up from that. That'll give you the returns. That'll give you the splash, the impact, as we say, in the company to get sponsorship to carry on with other projects, and then slowly build things up to a more strategic business process initiative, which then can involve all the other good stuff and analysing more processes.
Fantastic, thanks Barry. If Barry's slide there has presented any issues to you, then please feel free to ask a follow-up question for the panel by the questions tab. So to summarise there, Barry's saying basically start with the low-hanging fruit. I think it's a fair way to summarise that and build from there. So in your experience, Adrian, you've obviously implemented a lot of BPM projects. Is that the best way to start?
Yes, I mean that quadrant really picks up on where the first project should be identified and the shape of it, and how you need to work with the business to identify that, because they know what's going on. They know exactly what is high complexity, and they know what's high impact. Once they understand this model that Barry has sort of presented, if they understand the fundamentals of that, they can actually work this out fairly quickly with you. What would be really high impact but fairly quick for us? And if you just have the business in the room, you've got to be a little careful that you miss out some of the IT complexity that hangs underneath this. So I always would like to see this as a business-led initiative. It's got to be business-led, it must be. The business must understand what they're trying to do in terms of BPM at a strategic level, and then we come down into the project, we get IT who are there to help and implement and make sure that this happens. But if they're not there, then we may pick a project that could be, in business terms, quite straightforward. In IT terms, it might be much more complex. And that first project is very key.
Of course, if that first project's a raging success, if you're picking something that's fairly simple to do and has a wide impact, then you're more likely to get the mandate to go on and do further BPM projects, because they're going to see this great success and want to be associated with it.
So I really want to see high value in terms of business. I want to see it really making some sort of impact, and this low complexity in terms of implementation, as well as the process in terms of that implementation, which obviously takes into account where you are, your competencies within your IT systems and your architecture currently.
Okay, but moving that on, so obviously this is part of the scoping of the project. So the organisation has to assess the potential impact of the process management change before it decides whether to scope it in or out. So how would you go about assessing the impact of a potential change at this scoping phase? Barry, is that something you're able to answer?
Yes, I mean, I think I've obviously put a couple of ideas up there, but I think it'll be some kind of major return. It'll depend on what really are the major corporate objectives, and this brings in the whole strategic element to it quite early on. So even at the first project, we'll be looking at having some kind of strategic metrics that plug into whatever are the corporate metrics of that quarter or that fiscal year or whatever it is, right? So if I think of one large mobile telecommunications operator that we work with, they're concerned about customer excellence. That's their board initiative for this financial year. So customer excellence is around in terms of how they phone up every customer after the SIM card is activated, every time the phone is bought, every time a contract is renewed, every time a shop was visited and so forth, and there are all these surveys and working out. Those are the measures that they're looking at. Those are the measures they're using to drive things. Now, if you go into management consultancy, of course, you can break those things down into, strategic decomposition and so forth, right? That's the management consultancy side of things. On the IT side of things, you're obviously kind of you should at least be aware of what's going on there. You should be aware of which are the metrics that are important from a board level, and then put those in, right? So I'm not saying here revenue, cost, or customer service are the ones, they're just examples. But they should be the ones that are critical to your line of business or to your overall corporate strategy. And they should be the ones that you're focusing on.
I see. Adrian, do you have anything to add?
Yes, I mean, I agree with Barry. I think I'd add as well that we see another driver beginning to come up, which is risk of processes, or risk of the business. So if a process isn't defined and it's quite informal, then a process within a company can happen in different ways. And as a result of replacing the people within a company, you can actually get different results. So same company, selling the same thing, different result because people change. And that can be a risk, especially in financial services. But actually, most businesses with some sort of delivery capability would be concerned about that risk that moves with people. So a driver often that we see, in addition to those that you mentioned, Barry, is that can I standardise my process, therefore can I de-risk the business because I know we're going to follow this process which might have a regulatory sort of impact on us.
Andrew, do you have something to say on this area?
No, I think we've pretty much covered that one. So
okay,
yeah.
Excellent. Okay, well, one thing that occurs to me is it sounds extremely arduous. So when you're looking at beginning one of these BPM projects, you've got to assess the process complexity, taking factors into account like number of transitions, process exceptions. Does it require a huge amount of front-loaded effort to get into this sort of thing? And perhaps would that put people off, or is it simpler than it sounds, Barry?
I think it's simpler than it sounds. I think there's one important point we're making here, and really that's the idea of making sure things are less complex and yet have high impact, right? I think that's the important part. I think again and again we see customers looking at really the mother and father of all processes to start with, and that's the one beginner's error that I think we're saying here you need to avoid. If you understand that point, then I think the issues that are coming up in the survey here will be mitigated, right? That I think will, if you choose something that is high impact and low complexity, it's a very simple message, right? I think if you do that, you've gone. That's one of your major, 6 steps to successful BPM.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, well,
just add quickly on that. I think that was actually touching, that question really sort of touched on approach as well. I think it's very important to be quite agile in your approach to BPM. When you're working with the business, in order to get that support, in order to back that support up, the worst thing for them would be for you to disappear off, create a big document, get that shipped off, built and then brought back to them. What they like to see is something fairly quickly brought back to them where you can show them, it might be basic, but where you can show them something real. And that approach is very, very important. So the methodology you follow really begins to impact the success of this project in terms of the business backing. It does for every project, but when it's business driven, which BPM should be, I think it becomes even more important for them to see something.
That's extremely coincidental that you've gone down that angle, Adrian, because I've just had a question from the audience on pretty much that area, which is a question specifically to you, asking what sort of delivery approach, whether that be waterfall, agile, what sort of project management methodology, and modelling methodology, whether it's BPMN, UML, what do you use when delivering BPM projects? Is there one particular methodology you tend to go with, or do you use a spread depending on the situation?
Well, I mean, BPMN is driven by the modelling, and that's a modelling standard. So that is obviously important. That would be key to creating the model with the business. That would allow you to be more efficient in terms of then using that within the tools that you have within your business. So yes, BPM and very important, but I'm thinking more around here of working with the customer or working with the business in terms of making sure that they understand what's going on. So complete transparency. Working together with IT, but very much more business taking the responsibility for what they're taking on. So they need to own this process, it's theirs. They don't hand it over to IT. They need to keep up the expectation that this is something that they're going to continually improve on once they've got the first step in. And they continually need to see something. I think that that methodology based around a more agile approach would give them that transparency and that more immediate feedback. I would be very nervous about waterfall because it would tend to push you more towards a big definition exercise, a big requirements gathering exercise, a big document, large processes, and then a stop, and then an IT delivery phase. And I'm very uncomfortable with that long IT delivery phase and that long period of analysis. I think the business get bored, the business moves on, to be honest with you. So by the time they get back what they thought they wanted, it's not what they want anymore.
Okay, I'm sure again we could talk a lot more about this, but let's look at some real world examples. So let's see what Computing's readers said about the way they scoped their BPM project. So Andrew, could you tell us a little bit about how they responded?
Sure. I mean, you know, both Adrian and Barry have talked about go for projects which have low complexity and high impact. And when it's a shame actually that some of the people responding to the research hadn't seen that first, because what it looks like is that they've done quite the opposite. The BPM projects people are tackling tend to be really large. 10% of the respondents said they're tackling a single process, and about a quarter selected a few processes within a confined area. But 38% said they're tackling a large number of processes fundamental to the organisation, and 19% are just doing the whole thing, which sounds to me a bit like sort of, you know, dismantling your car and putting it back together again while you're still driving it along the highway. So that sounds like hard work. The only proviso I would say is maybe that's because the project they're referring to is the big strategic thing, and they are in fact biting off low complexity, high impact chunks as they go along, you know, which is Barry's advice. But you know, just looking at the bold figures, it looks as though people get embroiled in really big, complex projects straight away. So I think this is really pertinent stuff.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks, Andrew. As a former IT project manager myself, one thing that was always drummed into me early in my career is that projects have a very clearly defined beginning and end, a clear and agreed scope, and clear and agreed success criteria. So people seem prone to forget this when they're running BPM projects, and as we've just heard, they're going for far too much, perhaps allowing too much scope to creep in. So Barry, what's your view on how to best mitigate against this?
I think you've got to be very clear about what, from the outset, about what you're trying to do. Right now, in our experience, there's normally one kind of BPM champion in an organisation, and around that champion, there should be collected what we typically term a centre of excellence. Some people who, you know, have some kind of steering committee type approach to the BPM initiative. They're the people who should really take to heart a lot of what we've been saying in this, right? Work out and create, you know, from the pipeline of potential BPM processes, work out based upon, you know, these heuristics, which are the important ones, which ones are we going to work on, and so forth, and drive them through. That requires obviously somebody who has, you know, a certain amount of vision and a certain amount of clout within the organisation. So, you know, somebody at a relatively senior level in terms of developing that. And I think that can help in all this. It can help drive things along the ways that we're talking about, along best practice, drive things around particular approaches and methods, and drive the adoption of best practice, right? Because you know, in many ways, when it comes to the process, you know, many people are experts, but there needs to be this kind of steering to the whole thing. So what I'm also saying here is that while you're acting tactically, at the same time you're putting into place one or two strategic steering directional pieces. Then as you grow, you'll start using that a lot more.
I see. Adrian, has this been your experience in delivering projects, that this is something that's in place already?
You need to make sure it's in place, and it's very important when you start this project to identify where you are and where you want to be, because that's the roadmap we're talking about. If everyone is clear on that vision and that roadmap, you have then IT and business being able to align themselves. What do I mean by that? Well, business has defined where they are and where they want to get to. IT form that support role now, but it's very important for them to understand that, because they've got some work to do as well. in terms of the creation of the services that allow that flexibility. Otherwise, if you don't come in for the service-orientated architecture and the creation of services, you end up tying your business processes directly into applications, which will then you'll lose the rigidity, or you'll get the rigidity, you'll lose the flexibility that you need, that the business are expecting from this. Because otherwise you get in a situation, I can change a business process, that's great, but then the whole thing doesn't follow through. So you've got to make sure that IT understand where you're going, because then they can make their own plans and prepare for that. So I think one of the things that I was quite interested in that question, that 38%, was a large number of processes. That's a little worrying, a bit scary. We'll tackle that. Fundamental to the operation, great. So there's a bit of pleasure in there as well as fear. So when we come into a BPM project, let's take that 38%, let's look at it and break it down and manage them with it and say, okay, fundamental, agree, large number of processes, let's maybe large number of processes in where you are now to where you want to get to. Let's chunk that up as we mentioned earlier.
Fantastic. And just before we move on, I've got an interesting question from the audience here. How do you persuade business staff that BPM is not just another fad and won't be replaced by another acronym in 2 years' time? Barry, would you like to take that one?
No, that's a good question. And I think you do that by actually showing success. Right? And I think if you look around, there are various surveys around that you can find saying that the return of investment and the impact of BPM is high. Right? I think that's something that really is I don't think we need to spend a lot of time discussing that. I think BPM does have a high impact. It has a higher impact than most pure IT-based initiatives of the past. That's simply because it's much closer to the business. There's a much greater business involvement. So the business has a stakeholder. There are stakeholders in it, and this kind of partnership, this interlocking of business and IT that goes on, means there's shared risk and there's shared benefit. And that means that if the whole thing does go south, then there's shared blame also. But I mean, if you follow certain practices and certain approaches, methodologies that are out there, we have one on our website. There are many other. This best practice is actually condensed and is out there. It's available. So if you follow that, then you should have the successes that actually are published out there, and they're available from independent analysts and researchers in this area.
Fantastic. Okay, so I think we need to move on again, lest time defeat us. So Barry, if people are scoping large numbers of processes, what's the best way to go about implementing that? And I think you have a slide to talk us through on this area.
Yeah, so I think let's look at this slide. We have basically a couple of things here that we've been talking about, right? So if you start down the left-hand side, we've been speaking really about being able to walk before you can run, really. Now, at the end, obviously the ultimate, nirvana of BPM is some business transformational driven thing, and that's what people talk about, and that's what makes a lot of the headlines and so forth. But to get there, there are a couple of steps along the way, and I'm saying here, really the pilot program is actually quite key to building the BPM skills. Choose something of low complexity, high impact, get it out there, get the impact, get the visibility. We've been saying all the way along that if you choose the right project, you will have the impact, you'll get the business attention, you'll get the sponsorship, things will move on, right? So, and as you're building up this practice, there's a new way of working going on here between business and IT. You need to get people engaged. You need to set up practice teams. You need to set up processes and so forth. Right? Again, all that's documented in established best practice and methodologies that are out there. Right? But once you do that, you can be successful. Right? So here in London, for instance, one of our early customers in the financial sector, after we went live with the first project, we sat down on the Monday morning following, and they had 27 initiatives they wanted to do following on. That's the kind of impact that's typical, right? If you follow the right approach and do these things in the right way, so it can be successful. And then that's what we call viral growth. So that viral growth then builds up. Suddenly, everybody wants a piece of the party. They want a piece of the pie. They want to be part of the success, right? So at that point, I think then you need to have some of these things in place that we've been talking about. Centers of excellence, people who know where things are going, a strategic, if you like, strategic direction for the overall BPM initiative, not just a set of isolated projects. And then when that is in place, it'll set up the metrics, the tying of the metrics out into strategic initiatives inside the organization, and the filtering down of those initiatives then into process breakdown, and choosing which processes we do first, which process we do next, in order to deliver maximum value. And that then is slowly we're building up to a business transformation approach, right? And that's done in a way which is structured, which is established best practice, and which is known to work, right? And we have maybe a dozen organizations working in that way from our point of view. But that's the way it works. Whereas so that's the maturity and the adoption model that we'd suggest.
Adrian, do you have a comment to make on that?
I'll just pick up on the one area that is absolutely vital when looking and working with the business, which Barry mentioned in there, which is the priority. It's actually quite difficult to get down to making sure that the business prioritise these projects and the actual tasks and the functions and features within the projects. But you do not give up, you cannot give up. Whether it's an approach you're taking whereby during the creation of either your processes or your backlog or whatever your set of user stories, your use cases, whatever methodology and approach you use, make sure that priority is there. And I always like to attach a value to that backlog as well, so that we know how much a user story would add to the business, and we know what priority it is. That suddenly makes it very clear. And that work, remember, is done by the business jointly with IT. So we're both looking at this. And then we can look at the complexity, because the complexity there will suddenly become part of that analysis. So if we have priority, complexity, and benefit in a model, let's take a backlog, because that's a nice, easy approach to these projects, then I think it becomes very clear to the business and to IT what our job is and what this first pilot project is that's out of that. If you don't have that, then I think people go away with different views. And they go away and they think we're all doing different things. IT thinks something different to the business, and they've got different priorities.
I see. Fantastic. Thanks, Adrian. Okay, before we move on, I'd like to stop voting on our first poll and tell you the results. So we asked, what is or was the scope of your BPM project? So I will stop voting now, and I can see the results here. So we have a strong leader. A few processes within a defined area had 42% of the vote. Going down next with 29% of the vote, a large number of processes fundamental to the operation of the organisation. Just behind that, with 21% of the vote, processes which span the organisation and trading partners. And lastly, with just under 6% of the vote, a single process. So the vast majority, well, a majority, we're just having a few processes within a defined area, which sort of follows what we've been saying today. Barry, are you surprised by those results, or do you think that's a good indication?
I think it's a good indication of the audience, right? So I think it shows that the audience are moving in the right direction, right? So I'm encouraged by that. I think that is best practice, and that's the way to proceed.
Fantastic. Andrew, do you want to say anything on that?
Yeah, no, that's good, because obviously that's different to what came out of the survey. Those sort of two proportions are kind of inverted. So yeah, obviously a savvy audience. Yeah,
speaks well of our audience.
It does.
Okay,
yes.
Well done, you. Okay, and Adrian, do you agree?
Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense, and I think, as we've been saying here, you've got to look now at those few processes and make sure they add business value and impact.
Sure. Okay. Fantastic. Now on to our second poll question, which I will start voting now. This time we're asking, what are the greatest barriers to BPM within your organisation? And there are several options for you here. First of all, business processes don't extend outside the silos, resistance to change, budgetary constraints, or we don't think in terms of business process, or finally, you have the option there of don't know. You can enter your answers to the second poll anytime, roughly over the next 5 to 10 minutes. So we've covered scoping there and planning, so let's move on now to implementation, and specifically I'm going to ask a question about offshoring. So is offshoring a danger to BPM projects? So let's assume you scope the project well, but then you hand the implementation over to an offshore contractor who doesn't necessarily inherently understand the business. So is that a danger, and how would you mitigate against that? And again, I'll direct that to Barry first.
Okay. I think danger is something that would have to be measured, right? So I think it's a reality. I think a lot of offshoring takes places, and I think there are compelling reasons why it takes place. So I think settlement, fulfillment, call center operations, and so forth. A lot of that is offshored, and we run quite a number of our customers run processes where part of the process is offshored. And then there's the question of the implementation of that process also, maybe the implementation of the process being delivered by an offshore partner or whatever. Right? These are realities. I think there's a certain amount of experience out there in terms of offshoring, and I think offshoring can work if it's well controlled and well defined. Right? I think what we don't see is the offshoring of the core competency of an organization, the basic, if you like, fabric of an organization, which are its processes and its actual reality. The design of that is seldom done offshore. But if you manage it properly, then you can do offshoring. But I would say, obviously, you've spoken about the dangers. There are dangers there, and things can go horribly wrong. We've seen a number of projects where things have not worked out very well through lack of governance of offshoring. I think if you're going to do offshoring, very strong governance, very strong metrics, and very strong KPIs, then maybe you can get the benefits of offshoring.
I see. Adrian, have you managed many projects involving this level of offshoring?
Let me just talk about offshoring, because BPM projects have inherently, some quite high risk areas just in themselves. If you start adding in at a very early stage, particularly in the pilot stage on the previous slide, we saw the first step was the pilot. To be honest, if you start adding in an offshore element to that, I think you're completely mad. It would be just adding risk upon risk and barrier upon barrier in terms of communication and where you're going with the business and what you're doing and getting that partner involved. I think where you can consider it is if you have been through the process. So you have done the pilot, you have set up your approach, you're very clear on your methodology, you know, as Barry mentioned, what your metrics are. You've installed transparency into your approach so that you know what's happening. And I think if you then get the right offshore partner whereby you have worked this process a number of times, either within the house or with someone locally, I think that will allow you to have the confidence then to say, okay, what's the risk now? Let's assess the risk of trying to lower our cost per seat or per day level. Okay, so I would always say to you, look at the cost of a project. I think people always think about the day rates. People are really focused on day rates. I think great, okay, that's understandable. But actually, people who understand IT, people who really understand the BPM process, start to look at it and say, actually, the cost of this project is really important. How can I get what I want? Be transparent with the supplier in-house or whatever, to make sure that when we do come into difficulties, fall into those holes, then we can deal with them together. The worst thing for me for any project, but particularly with BPM, would be waterfall, specification, off you go offshore, see you in X months, bring back my system, because I don't think that'll work. So if you can change that model, you've proven it in-house, you know how to work it, you've measured it, you've got the transparency, you've got a good approach, then maybe you can consider that offshore element.
I see. Fantastic. Thanks, Adrian. We are beginning to run lowish on time, so I'm going to move on now. So we've moved on to the implementation phase of the project. So Andrew, how long are organisations finding that BPM projects are taking on the whole?
Okay, well, I mean, given the results of the survey, where nearly 60% were tackling projects that encompass either all or a large proportion of the organisation's processes, it's not surprising to see that people are, really sort of stuck into projects that stretch out for 6 months or more. That seemed to be the sort of majority there. Less than 1 in 5 have projects that are shorter than 3 months. And 10% of the people said their projects had no scheduled end, which is a little bit worrying, really. Again, maybe this is because they see BPM much more as a journey rather than a destination, and remaking the company just goes on all the time. But we're talking here about projects rather than BPM as a philosophy. And I think that's really concerning to see 10% saying, I have no idea how long it will take. That's from the survey. So, it looks as though there's a lot of people stuck in for the long duration.
I see. Thanks, Andrew. Barry, do you have a comment to make on that area?
Yeah, I think what we'd like to see is we'd like to see people here somewhere around the 3 months mark. I think this feeds into what Adrian was saying around agile. I think things need to be time bounded. They need to be worked in conjunction with the business very closely, and they need to have this kind of go in, what we call sprints, or relatively, well time boxed deliveries, right? And that's typically how we also propose it, right? So something between 8 to 12 weeks. Your first run might take a little bit longer. You've got a bit of skilling up and so forth, but every single process that you deliver should work in that period of time. Again, if we split out between the strategic and the tactical, between the project and the programmatic, obviously you can have a program that runs many years. That's not a problem. But each individual project in that program should be running around the 8 to 12 week time frame. Once you've got it chugging and up and running, and you've got a well-oiled machine in terms of your skill sets, your people, and your, dare I say it, internal processes for delivering those actual projects, then you can churn them out in those periods of time, and you should be churning them out in those periods of time.
I see. Adrian, I could see you nodding there during that. Do you agree with that level of time?
I do agree with it. I think the important point there is probably the length of your sprint. So how long have you chunked up your piece of work so that you've got, I suppose, lots of little chunks in sprints whereby you are at the end of that delivering something that is real to the business that you can show them. So if you're talking about something that is 3 weeks in length, maybe 4 weeks in length, then you're coming back to the business with something real that you can show them. And I think probably if you're talking about your first pilot, you don't want to be talking about too many sprints before we actually say, okay, now we have done this is of real value and we can promote it into production. Because I do like to see on all of the projects that promotion process through your environments, because that proves to me that we can do it. If you just stick it in, DevInt or you're sticking it in, some sort of level of QA, then it does concern me that it's not getting through. So I'd like to see short sprints, deliverables, and then actually running through that whole process, because that would de-risk the project for me.
Fantastic, thanks Adrian. Okay, so moving on again, let's have a look at what computing readers said about the barriers to further BPM in their organisations. And Andrew, I think you have some work on this.
I mean, this is where it becomes sort of interesting, really moving away from typical IT challenges and into issues around corporate culture. Now, sure, budgetary constraints are the number one hurdle to BPM projects. You'd expect that with an IT project, but actually resistance to change isn't far behind, and we can have a look at why that's the case. I mean, exposing business processes for change can be really very disruptive. Processes often map across multiple systems. Customer databases, MRP, financials, that sort of thing. It'll involve bespoke software or at best packaged software that's been modified for the client. And the processes kind of need untangling, and we talked about that. Adrian's talked about how processes can be more complex than you think. You think you're doing a simple claim, and then it's a change of address in there as well. And so you may have to sort of rip them out in order to change them. But when it comes to automation, there's a need to integrate the people, heterogeneous people, as well as the systems. If the organisation's heavily siloed, then BPM may well mean a cultural change, which is notoriously difficult. The sort of MBAs sound off about this for whole books in length. And where the processes cross these sort of functional silos, you can get disconnects, distortions to the processes, and coordinating these processes across silos was one of the sort of, the major challenges that came up, along with resistance to change. Why do people resist change? Well, for a departmental manager, this might, he might regard the processes that he oversees as like his private fiefdom, so changing them may involve loss of power, loss of autonomy, loss of people, budget, all those sort of things. So although budget is cited as the biggest barrier by 54%, resistance to change is not far behind at 42%. And you can see how some projects involve not just asking how a process is done, but why. Why is it there at all? What's the outcome for the customer, whether that customer is internal or external? What does the process serve? The conclusion I guess we came to in a way was that organisations shouldn't be surprised if they struggle with BPM. It would be more surprising if they didn't, because this is about reshaping the organisation, when we look at this very high level strategic view. And so they will get opposition from people who don't want to change. And I think some of the secret to this is knowing how to deal with those people who don't want to change, and how to overcome those objections.
Fantastic, thanks Andrew. So Barry, it's resistance to change and organisational change that are, in general, are holding people up. So how can we get around that?
I think if we look very closely at the survey here, is bang on the money, really, as far as I'm concerned. I think resistance to change is the key issue. I think you've got to build in change management as one of the fundamental planks of your BPM strategy. I can tell you that technology is probably only around maybe 20% of a BPM solution. Technology is probably one of the least difficult parts of this. Change and culture management, for my money, will be right up there. It's probably around 40-50% of what you're trying to do. So change management is obviously beyond the scope of this web seminar, but there's a lot of information. There's a lot of good books out there, good courses out there on change management, and I'd highly recommend them. Do your homework, have a look at them, plug in, make sure that somebody in your Centre of Excellence for BPM is versed and trained in change management. Change management, ultimately, when you break it all down, is all about communicating. Communication, communicate, and communicate, right? But there's a science behind it. Make sure it's part of your strategy, because it's going to undo your BPM strategy if you don't have it built in there.
Sure. Adrian, in your experience, has this been quite a fetter to implementations, this resistance?
It falls into two camps, the projects. If you have CEO level sponsorship with CIO backing you completely, resistance to change across those silos and departments, and that ownership of that process becomes a lot easier, because they know this is something that's going to happen with or without them. And if you can get that leadership and sponsorship to actually bring the business with you, to understand that actually this is going to give you more power, this is going to give you the time to think about what you should be doing with your business, rather than trying to act within your silo. You can think about the whole process. So you suddenly got a team of senior managers working together, because they know that actually their little bit of the silo, yes, they can get right, but it doesn't really matter how efficient or how good you are, unless this whole process end to end is working and is much more efficient and offers the competitive advantage to the customer that the business needs to increase customers. So resistance to change in that area becomes less if you've got that high sponsorship, and actually becomes interest, excitement, power to the business, thinking about what they should be doing, not thinking about IT or politics. Resistance to change when you've got BPM aimed at a project suddenly changes the whole thing, because if it's just one area, one department, one small project, you have to question really whether that is just BPM because it's something that's useful to that particular project as a tool. And I'm not really sure whether that approach occupies resistance to change, because what it is, it's just a project and it's being delivered. It happens to have BPM as part of it. but it's not really changing the fundamental thinking of, are we thinking applications now when we're talking about IT, or are we actually talking about business processes? And delivering business processes and focusing on that. And if you've got that conversation going on, business get excited, resistance to change lowers. If you've got talking about applications, then that's usually within a department. It might have a BPM element to it, which might help it, and great, but it's all about the silo and the resistance to change within that, and people not really working on the complete process.
I see, fantastic. So I think it's quite comforting in a way that a lot of these problems come back to the same fundamental principles. Get the basics right, so don't overscope, make sure you've got the correct mandate and the correct sponsorship, and that's going to solve a lot of your problems. So it's just about managing projects properly in the same way that you'd manage any other type of project, and then you're much more likely to experience success in the BPM space, it seems. Okay, so in the interest of time, we are going to have to move on again, so I'm going to close the voting on our second poll and see what our audience thinks of these issues. So once again, we have a fairly clear winner, and coincidentally enough, it is resistance to change. So we asked, what are the greatest barriers to further BPM in your organisation? As we've just been talking about, resistance to change is number one with 41%. A long way behind, with 20%, was budgetary constraints, which Andrew was alluding to earlier. Shortly behind that with 19% is we don't think in terms of business process. Behind that with 12% is business process, don't extend outside the silos, and 6% said don't know. So I think that's very much backing up what we're discussing here. It's resistance to change. It really has been a crucial issue, and hopefully some of our discussion today will help with those issues going forward. So that's all our polls today. So we're going to move the discussion on now. So far we've looked at planning, scoping, implementation and barriers. So finally we'll look at success criteria. We need to look at how you know whether or not your project has succeeded. So Andrew, could you tell us what our readers said about this?
Yeah, okay. I mean, we didn't go into any sort of huge detail on this. We really just asked, what were the metrics of success? We know BPMs are, much more of an ongoing discipline rather than a project or a product. And for the IT department, it can feel like this sort of continuous journey, particularly in fast-moving companies. It's a real sort of discipline of constant change. So measuring the success can be really difficult. Externalities like competitors or the economic environment can have, a bigger impact than the process change itself. For just over half the respondents, success was measured against the initial aims, which is great. For a smaller proportion, 22%, it's just about bringing the thing in on time and within budget, which we all know with IT projects can, be a cause for celebration in itself. Worryingly, nearly 1 in 5 had no metric at all in place, which I think has the danger that you never quite know when you can go on to the next thing. Is the business pleased with this? I think, whether the business considers it a success, there are various ways of measuring that, and that will probably depend on what the aim of the project was and the type of project that you're doing, the type of business that you're in. So yeah, pretty much people were measuring against outcome, but some people weren't measuring success at all. So that will probably give us something to talk about, I imagine.
Barry, we're running low on time, but do you have any comments to make on the success criteria?
I think this is a very encouraging result, right? And I think one of the good things that BPM brings you is visibility and metric. Okay, so the fact that more than half people have actually, got the outcomes against their initial aim show that it's delivering the results. And I think what the results are showing us that people simply have to define them. If they define them, they can measure them and they can get the results. That's something that BPM gives you, and it gives you it basically in spades. So I'm very encouraged by this result.
Fantastic. Adrian, do you have anything to add on that area?
Ask the question. I think the reason that it's not there is it's usually not asked, and if it is asked, it's not shared and publicised. So it's got to be part of the project objectives. Everyone's there, they understand where we are, where we're going to, and what that goal is, and therefore we can measure it. So I'd be surprised where by the 22% said the new processes in place on time and budget, they're probably coming at it from either a finance or an IT sort of angle more than understanding actually what the outcome is.
I see. Fantastic. And we are almost out of time, but I'm just going to ask one last question from the audience. I think it's an interesting one. The question has come in asking, should BPM initiatives become continuous improvement, or should businesses in general be given an opportunity to live with the improved to be process after improvement and allowed to deliver from within the new process to truly understand the issues within it?
Yes. Very quick answer, yes. That's where we really want to get to. BPM, again and again, will start as an IT initiative, but it will slowly and should grow into being a business controlled and owned initiative with IT as a service provider. If business owns that through a set of business analysts, through a set of participation in the overall delivery process, defining the metrics, defining the processes, having ownership of control of those processes and their improvements based upon the metrics they're getting out of the live processes, then BPM is a success. And that's the way it should go.
Fantastic. Do you have a final comment to make, Adrian?
Agreed. No, I've agreed on that. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thanks very much. Well, I'm afraid that's all we have time for today. So on behalf of our audience, thank you very much to Barry, Adrian and Andrew for your insights today. And thank you to you as well, the audience, for submitting your questions, and I hope you found our answers helpful. We've been talking today about 6 steps to successful business process management. Thank you for attending this web seminar, and we certainly hope you found it informative. Goodbye.